Spidergate Cemetery, with its eerie reputation and haunting legends, truly captures the imagination. The juxtaposition of its serene Quaker origins and the tales of dark rituals creates a fascinating, albeit unsettling, atmosphere. Locals speak of the cemetery as a place where time stands still, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur. The rumored summoning of spirits adds to its mystique, inviting thrill-seekers and paranormal enthusiasts alike. The idea of a central altar for satanic worship only deepens the sense of foreboding that hangs over the site. The tragic stories, like the murder of the young girl and the boy's suicide, weave a narrative of sorrow that echoes through the graves, lending a somber weight to the cemetery's haunted reputation. Visitors often report feelings of unease or the sensation of being watched, reinforcing the belief that something otherworldly lingers in the shadows. Whether a genuine gateway to hell or simply a chilling slice of local folklore, Spidergate Cemetery remains an enigmatic testament to the power of legend and the mysteries of the unknown. As dusk settled over Spidergate Cemetery, the air grew thick with an otherworldly silence. Shadows lengthened, and the moon began its ascent, casting an ethereal glow that illuminated the weathered tombstones. A group of friends, drawn by the allure of the supernatural, gathered at the entrance, hearts racing with both excitement and trepidation. "Are we really going in?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The stories had circulated for years, but the reality of standing at the cemetery gates felt far more daunting than she had anticipated. "Come on, it's just a cemetery," Jake replied, trying to sound brave. But even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing into a realm where the living and the dead coexisted in a delicate balance. They stepped through the wrought iron gate, the creak echoing in the stillness, and ventured deeper into the overgrown paths. The air felt charged, almost electric, as they moved past crumbling headstones and twisting vines. Each step seemed to amplify the tension among them, as if the cemetery itself was holding its breath. "Let's find the altar," Mark suggested, his voice laced with eagerness. He had read about it online, a focal point for the alleged dark rituals that took place long ago. As they navigated the maze of tombstones, whispers of the past seemed to swirl around them, beckoning them closer to the heart of the cemetery. They finally stumbled upon a clearing, where the ground dipped slightly and a weathered stone slab lay half-buried beneath layers of moss. This was it, the fabled altar. It felt as if the air had thickened, and an unsettling chill wrapped around them. The friends exchanged glances, a mix of curiosity and fear swirling in their eyes. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught Sarah's attention. In the dim light, she swore she saw a figure darting between the trees, pale and fleeting. "Did you see that?" she gasped, gripping Jake's arm tightly. "Probably just a deer," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Still, the tension was palpable, and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. They gathered around the altar, and Mark suggested they try to summon a spirit, despite the unease that gripped them. "What do we have to lose?" he asked, though deep down, he was aware that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. With hesitant voices, they began to chant the names of the lost, their words barely breaking the stillness. As the final syllable left their lips, a sudden rush of wind swept through the clearing, sending a shiver down their spines. The temperature plummeted, and the very ground beneath them felt alive, pulsating with an energy that sent alarm bells ringing in their minds. Then, a soft whisper floated through the air, almost like a breath carried on the wind. It was indistinct at first, but as they strained to listen, the words began to take shape, laced with a sorrow that resonated deeply. "Help me!" The voice was faint, but it cut through the night like a knife, sending the group into a frenzy. Panic surged as they glanced around, the reality of their surroundings settling heavily upon them. What had they summoned? And what would it mean for them if they didn't leave before it was too late? They turned to flee, but the path back to the entrance felt different, more twisted, more unfamiliar. The shadows seemed to stretch, coiling around them as if to trap them in this haunted realm. With every frantic step, they could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting for their next move. In that moment, they realized the true legends of Spidergate Cemetery were far more than just stories, they were warnings. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As they dashed through the cemetery, the familiar landmarks began to blur, their minds racing with fear and uncertainty. The headstones loomed like sentinels in the dark, each one a reminder of lives long past. Yet now they felt like obstacles in a twisted maze. Which way do we go? Sarah panted, glancing back over her shoulder as if expecting to see the source of that haunting whisper. The shadows danced around them, almost taunting, as if the cemetery itself conspired to keep them trapped within its grasp. Just keep moving, Mark shouted, adrenaline coursing through him as they pushed deeper into the night. The sounds of their hurried breaths mixed with the rustling leaves, creating a chaotic symphony of panic. Suddenly, Jake stumbled, his foot catching on a root hidden beneath the foliage. He fell hard, the sound echoing through the eerie stillness. Go! I'll catch up, he urged, wincing as he scrambled to his feet. No way, we're not leaving you, Sarah insisted, fear flickering in her eyes. But even as she spoke, a sense of dread crept in. What if they didn't all make it out? Mark hesitated, glancing back toward Jake, who was shaking off the fall. We need to find the gate. Now! He grabbed Sarah's arm and began pulling her forward. But the cemetery felt alive, shifting underfoot as if it were closing in around them. The air grew heavier, thick with a palpable tension that made it hard to breathe. It felt as if the very ground were whispering, urging them to listen, to turn back. As they stumbled through the underbrush, the trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Wait, Jake called, finally catching up. Did you hear that? They paused, the oppressive silence settling once more. But then the whispering returned, softer now, like a lullaby tinged with sorrow. It swirled around them, pulling at their senses, almost seductive in its melody. Help us. Find us. What does it want? Sarah whispered, her heart racing. We can't help them. Mark's face was pale as he glanced at Jake. It's a trick. We need to ignore it. But just as they resumed their hurried escape, a piercing scream echoed through the cemetery, rising from the depths of the shadows. It was a sound of pure anguish, a cry that seemed to originate from the very ground they stood on. The friends froze, a chill washing over them. Run! Mark shouted, and they broke into a sprint, panic fueling their flight. They dashed through the tangled paths, dodging tombstones and twisted roots, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, almost desperate. With every step, the sensation of being pursued intensified, a shadow lurking just out of sight, trailing them through the darkness. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, the weight of fear pressing down like a heavy shroud. Suddenly, Sarah stumbled again, and before they could stop, she fell to her knees. I can't, she gasped, the energy draining from her. Get up. We can't stop, Jake urged, reaching out to help her up, but the ground seemed to hold her in place. Leave me, she cried, eyes wide with terror. Just go. Mark and Jake exchanged a panicked glance, torn between the instinct to help her and the desperate need to escape. The whispers grew louder, coiling around them like smoke, wrapping them in a chilling embrace. Please, help us. The plea resonated deep within Sarah, and for a moment, she felt an overwhelming pull toward the ground. Images flashed before her eyes, faces twisted in pain, sorrowful eyes begging for release. No, she shouted, shaking her head. I can't. I won't. But it was too late. The darkness surged around them, and in that instant, the air vibrated with a thunderous roar, shaking the very earth beneath their feet. A blinding light exploded from the center of the cemetery, illuminating the night and casting long shadows that danced wildly. The whispers morphed into a cacophony of wails, rising to a fever pitch as the ground began to tremble. What is happening? Jake shouted, gripping Sarah's arm as if to anchor her against the chaos. I don't know, Mark yelled back, but even he felt the pull, an undeniable urge to stay and listen to the anguished voices of the dead. In that moment of crisis, they had to make a choice. to confront the forces that lingered in the cemetery or flee into the night, leaving behind whatever secrets the place held. And as the ground shuddered again, they realized that whatever lay ahead could alter the very fabric of their reality if they survived to tell the tale. The blinding light engulfed them, and for a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. Shadows twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that flickered at the edges of their vision. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding in her chest, but the sound of the wailing voices penetrated her defenses. "Help us! Find us!" It was a chorus of despair, echoing through her mind, pulling her deeper into the cemetery's grip. "Sarah!" Jake shouted, trying to shake her from the trance. "We have to move." But she felt rooted, entranced by the haunting beauty of the light. Images swirled in her mind, grief-stricken faces, desperate souls reaching out for something they could never grasp. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown her. "Mark, we can't leave her," Jake pleaded, glancing back at his friend, who was caught between instinct and fear. "Sarah!" Mark yelled again, desperation creeping into his voice. "You have to fight it. It's not real." The ground continued to tremble, and suddenly, the blinding light flickered, revealing the source of the wails. Shadowy figures emerged, their forms indistinct yet undeniably human, hovering just beyond the illumination. They reached out with elongated fingers, their faces twisted in anguish. "Help us!" they cried, the sound merging with the howl of the wind, creating an unsettling symphony of sorrow. "Sarah, come on," Jake urged, panic rising as the figures inched closer. The energy in the air crackled, thickening with a malevolent presence that seemed to swirl around them. With a final, defiant shake, Sarah opened her eyes. "No, I won't help you," she shouted, as if to break free from the thrall. The shadows recoiled slightly, the wailing growing fainter for a moment, but the pull was still there, insistent and deep. "Let's go." Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. The sudden movement jolted her senses, and she stumbled back, blinking against the brightness. The three of them stood together, backs pressed against the altar, facing the gathering shadows. The figures lingered at the edges of the light, their eyes hollow and pleading. "Why won't you help us?" one figure implored, stepping closer. It was a woman, her features indistinct yet hauntingly familiar, a shadow of someone they might have known in life. "What do you want from us?" Mark demanded, voice steady despite the tremors in his hands. "Release from this place," the woman replied, her voice a whisper that floated through the air, full of desperation. "You have the power to set us free." Sarah exchanged a glance with Jake and Mark. "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. The figure gestured toward the altar. "Speak the words of remembrance. They bind us here. Break the spell." Jake's mind raced. "We can't just trust them. What if it's a trick?" But as the shadows closed in, the urgency of their situation became clear. The cemetery felt alive, pressing in around them. The wailing rose once more, echoing in their ears, threatening to swallow them whole. "Mark, what do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. "We have to take a chance," he decided, his resolve hardening. "If they're trapped, we can't leave them here. They deserve peace." "Okay, but we need to be careful," Jake replied, swallowing hard. "We'll say the names of the dead. Honor them. That should weaken whatever binds them." As they positioned themselves around the altar, they took a deep breath, hearts pounding. "On three," Mark said, and they nodded, bracing themselves for what was to come. 1, 2, 3. In unison, they began to speak the names of the departed, invoking the memories of those lost to time. As their voices mingled, a resonance filled the air, a vibrating energy that coursed through the ground beneath them. The shadows writhed, twisting in agitation. The light around them pulsed, flickering like a heartbeat. "Help us," the figures wailed, the sound a mixture of hope and despair. With every name they spoke, the atmosphere grew heavier, the figures drawing closer, their faces shifting between anguish and relief. And then, suddenly, The air exploded with a brilliant flash, and the shadows recoiled as if struck by lightning. "Keep going," Mark urged, pushing through the growing chaos. "We can't stop now." As they continued to chant, the cemetery began to shift, the ground trembling violently beneath their feet. Cracks formed in the earth, and the light intensified, revealing more figures emerging from the darkness, all crying out for freedom. "Let them go!" Sarah screamed, feeling the weight of their collective pain. With a final, resounding name, the atmosphere surged, and the ground erupted in a blinding flash. The light enveloped them completely, and for a moment, they felt suspended in time, caught between two worlds. Then, with a deafening roar, the shadows surged forward, colliding with the light in a tumultuous wave. The ground shook violently, sending them sprawling as the air crackled with energy. In that moment, they realized they had awakened something powerful, something that had been buried beneath the weight of loss for far too long. And as the chaos unfolded around them, they braced for whatever came next, uncertain if they had truly set the trapped souls free, or if they had unleashed a darkness that would consume them all. As the chaos reached its peak, the blinding light and shadow collided, sending shockwaves through the cemetery. Sarah, Mark, and Jake struggled to stay on their feet, the ground heaving beneath them. For an instant, the world around them seemed to split apart, the fabric of reality fraying at the edges. "Hold on!" Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm as they tumbled to the ground. Jake instinctively shielded them with his body, his heart racing with fear and determination. They could feel the presence of the shadows closing in, but now there was something else, a sense of liberation mingling with the despair. With one final, desperate push, they called out the last name, a name they had forgotten until now. "Emily!" Sarah cried, remembering the young girl whose story had haunted the town for decades. As the name echoed through the cemetery, the shadows hesitated, their forms flickering between sorrow and hope. The light surged, illuminating the entire clearing, and the figures of the lost seemed to pause, suspended in time. "Emily," the shadowy woman whispered, her voice trembling with recognition. "You remember?" In that moment, the cemetery erupted in a cacophony of sound. The wails transformed into a harmonious chorus, a beautiful lament that resonated with a deep, abiding sorrow. The figures around them began to shimmer, their edges softening as if they were no longer bound by the weight of grief. "Thank you," the woman said, tears of light streaming down her translucent face. "You've given us the gift of remembrance." With that, the shadows surged toward the light, intertwining and spiraling together, creating a vortex of shimmering energy. The ground trembled one last time, and then everything fell silent. The air was still, and the oppressive darkness that had enveloped them began to recede. Slowly, the friends stood, breathing heavily, eyes wide with disbelief. The cemetery looked different now, almost ethereal, the moonlight illuminating the headstones with a soft glow. The air felt lighter, the lingering whispers of despair replaced by an overwhelming sense of peace. "Did we?" Jake began, glancing around, unsure of what had just happened. Mark nodded, still processing the events. "I think we did. We set them free." As the trio made their way back toward the entrance, a profound calm settled over them. The shadows that had once haunted the cemetery were gone, leaving behind only the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of night creatures. Yet even as they stepped through the wrought iron gates, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery still held mystery stories waiting to be told, memories waiting to be honored. "We should come back," she said quietly. "Not to summon anything, but to remember." "Yeah," Mark agreed, a sense of responsibility settling upon him. "They deserve to be remembered." Jake nodded, looking back at the now serene landscape. "Next time we'll bring flowers." As they walked away from Spidergate Cemetery, the weight of what they had experienced hung in the air, a reminder of the fragility of life and the power of memory. Each step forward was a promise to honor the lost, to listen to the whispers of the past, and to remember that even in darkness, there could be light. And though the legends of Spidergates would live on, entwined with tales of terror and tragedy, the truth remained. Some spirits were not just meant to be feared, they were meant to be set free. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.